The sun dipped low behind the rolling hills of West Texas, casting a coppery hue across the Branson Ranch. Dust hung thick in the air, shimmering in the fading light. Inside the old ranch house, the long oak dining table groaned beneath the weight of a home-cooked meal pot roast, mashed potatoes, cornbread, and sweet tea. But no one was eating. Caleb Branson sat at the head of the table, his flinty eyes scanning the plates, his fork untouched. 42, weary, and weather-worn from years under the sun, he looked like a man who'd carved his bones from the same dust that coated his boots. On his right sat Emily, 29, porcelain-skinned, her auburn hair pinned back too tightly, as though trying to contain whatever storm brewed beneath. Her eyes flicked between her untouched glass and Caleb's clenched jaw. The silence was brittle. "I wasn't expecting company tonight," Caleb finally muttered. Looking up at the man seated across from him, Reed Branson offered a crooked smile, as if to deflect the tension. His denim shirt was sweat-stained, and he hadn't shaved in days. "Didn't think I needed an invitation, brother. Not to Miss Table. That was Miss Table 10 years ago. Now it's mine." Emily pressed her napkin to her lips, hiding the faint curve of a smirk. Narration took over again as Reed leaned back in his chair. The weight of old grudges thickened the room, invisible but choking. Reed hadn't been seen on the property in 5 years, not since he'd accused Caleb of stealing their father's land out from under him, while he was off working oil fields in Oklahoma. "I just wanted to say goodbye, that's all," Reed said softly. "Heard you were selling the east side. Thought I'd see it one more time before it disappears into someone else's name." Caleb grunted. "That land was never yours to begin with." Emily reached for her glass. Her wedding band flashed under the chandelier's dim glow, though it looked almost too heavy for her slim hand. "Can we just eat?" she whispered. "Please." They did, or tried to. The scrape of silverware filled the void where conversation should have been. Caleb chewed methodically, eyes drifting to the old rifle mounted above the fireplace. Reed picked at his food like it might bite him. Emily pushed peas around her plate in silence. At some point, Caleb rose without a word and walked out to the porch. Emily followed a moment later, arms crossed against the chill. "Why'd you let him in?" she asked. "He's blood, and blood's hard to wash off," Caleb replied, staring at the horizon. "But don't worry, he won't be back after tonight. You say that like something's gonna happen." He looked at her then, his eyes unreadable. Something always does when Reed shows up. Inside, Reed lingered over his drink. His fingers trembled slightly as he set the glass down. He looked at the wedding photo on the mantel. Caleb and Emily, under a mesquite tree, smiling like they had no idea the storm they were walking into. Or maybe they had. By the time the sky turned black and coyotes howled in the distance, Caleb was gone. His boots were still on the porch. The dog, Blue, sat beside them, whining into the wind. Emily stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the night. She didn't call for him, didn't text, just stood there, arms limp, mouth slightly parted, as if she was trying to recall what silence sounded like before it became permanent. In the guest room, Reed lay on the bed, fully clothed, eyes wide open. Somewhere far off, a screen door slammed. And just like that, the Last Supper ended. By the time the sun rose over the dry Texas plain, Caleb Branson was nowhere to be found. Emily stood barefoot on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the empty spot where his truck used to sit. The only sound was the soft thump of Blue's tail against the floorboards. The old dog hadn't moved since last night, eyes fixed on the horizon, ears twitching at every gust of wind. By 9 a.m., the ranch hands were already whispering. "Storm must have gotten in his head," one muttered. "He's probably just coolin' off," said another. Though he didn't sound convinced. Emily called the sheriff's office around 10. Not because she was worried, she said, but because Caleb's wallet and phone were still inside. That wasn't like him, not even close. Sheriff Murdoch showed up alone, dragging dust behind his cruiser like a lazy snake. He was nearing retirement, with a gut that pressed against his belt and a face like cracked leather. Caleb had been his hunting buddy back in the day. Now he stepped out of the car with the caution of a man walking into a fire he didn't want to put out. "Morning, Miss Emily," he said, nodding. "He didn't come home last night. Walk off angry. He went outside after dinner and just didn't come back. You call Reed?" She shook her head. "Didn't think it was my place." Murdoch squinted at the sky, then back at the ranch. "Let's check the fence line. If he's out there, might have had a fall." Narration carried the moment as they followed the dry trail past the barn and into the fields, where the wire fencing stretched toward the foothills like skeletal fingers. It was hot already, the kind of heat that dried out your soul. At the edge of the east pasture, they found Caleb's truck. The keys were still in the ignition. Driver's door wide open, a half-full thermos on the seat. "No tracks leading away," Murdoch said. Crouching beside the tire marks, no signs of a struggle either. Just stops. Emily stood several feet back, arms crossed, jaw tight. "He liked to walk," said. It cleared his head. "Yeah," Murdoch muttered. That or something was waiting for him. The next few hours passed in slow, dusty sweeps. 2 deputies and a few town volunteers showed up, combing the property and the dry creek beds with long sticks and grim expressions. No one found anything. No blood, no footprints, no torn clothing. Caleb had vanished like breath on glass. That night, Emily made dinner for one and ate in silence. Blue still hadn't left the porch. "He'll come back," Emily said aloud. Though no one was listening. "He always does." Murdoch wasn't so sure. The next morning, he asked around town. Folks at the diner said Caleb had been off lately, talking to himself, drinking more, arguing with someone on the phone, a woman, maybe. No one ever saw her. "Heard he had secrets," said the waitress. "But don't we all?" Cinematic description. A storm rolled in on the third day, thunder low and mean, clouds swollen and gray. Rain hit the dirt like a cleansing purge, but it didn't wash away the questions. Emily stood at the window, watching the lightning tear across the sky. Her face was calm to calm. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. In the distance, Reed's beat-up truck rumbled away from the ranch. No one saw him leave. And on the porch, Blue still waited head low, eyes fixed on the road. 2 months passed. No sign of Caleb. No new leads. No updates from the sheriff's office, except a polite but hollow statement. "We're still following every avenue." Emily sold off the east field in late September. Said the upkeep was too much without Caleb. She didn't wear black, didn't put up flyers, just filed paperwork, signed the deed over to a family from El Paso, and kept her eyes low at the courthouse. What stirred the town wasn't her grief. It was the barbecue. She hosted it on a golden Saturday afternoon, just weeks after the land sale finalized. An open invite cookout at the Branson Ranch. Brisket smoked low and slow. Country music floated on the breeze. Beer cracked open like old wounds. It wasn't mourning. It was celebration. And Reed Branson was there. Some said they saw him laughing with Emily near the smoker, his hand lingering a little too long on her back. Others swore they disappeared behind the barn for nearly 20 minutes. Emily reappeared first, red-lipped, adjusting her blouse. Reed came out a minute later, lighting a cigarette with shaky hands. The whispers began that night and never stopped. Ain't even cold in the ground, muttered June Holly, who ran the local diner, assuming he's in the ground at all. Tellin'. You, said a trucker at the counter. That woman's snake's lick. Read to. Always was trouble. Narration deepens as we glimpse Emily's past through flickering memory. Late nights with Caleb pacing the hallway, shouting at no one in particular, locking himself in the study, glaring at Emily if she stayed up too late, or wore lipstick that was too red. You're not one of those women, he once hissed. After she'd bought a dress without asking, she had learned to become small, to be quiet, to dress plain and smile politely at church. And when Caleb touched her, it was more ownership than affection, firm hands, cold breath. A man staking claim. So when Reed returned, something unspoken passed between them. Maybe it had always been there, a shared wound, a look that lingered. Too long. Emily had once caught Reed watching her from the hayloft during a summer storm years ago. He said nothing, just smoked and stared as thunder rolled behind him. Now, with Caleb gone, the lines blurred. That night after the barbecue, Emily and Reed sat on the porch steps while the last of the guests drove away. Empty bottles littered the grass. Fireflies hovered in the silence. You always planned on coming back, didn't you? She asked, voice low. Reed looked away. Not like this. She tilted her head, studied him. But you're not surprised, are you? He didn't answer. You ever think about that night? She continued. The Last Supper? Reed swallowed. I try not to. Emily smiled faintly. I do. Cinematic description. Inside the diner, the lights flickered above chipped counters and sticky menus. June wiped down a table near the window. A young waitress leaned close to her, whispering just loud enough to hear. I heard them talking by the pit. He said, you made me part of this. And she told him to lower his damn voice. Swear on my mama. June straightened up. Her eyes narrowed. You didn't hear that, she said. But she had, and others would too. As autumn settled over the Branson land, something festered beneath the soil. It wasn't just the mystery of Caleb's disappearance. It was the growing realization that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened. Dan was starting to crack. Emily slept soundly most nights now. Reed, however, had started drinking. Again. It was a Tuesday when the sheriff's office got the call. No name, no voice, just a single message left on the department's voicemail. Check behind the Branson barn. You'll find it in the dirt, near the hose. Sheriff Murdoch played it twice before lighting a cigarette he wasn't supposed to smoke anymore. He didn't like anonymous tips. They usually came from the guilty or the dangerously curious. But this one had weight. The next morning, 2 deputies arrived at the Branson ranch in a dusty cruiser, half expecting nothing. Emily met them on the porch, dressed in a pressed white shirt and dark jeans, her face calm but guarded. We need to look near the barn, Deputy Clark said. It won't take long. Emily didn't flinch. Go ahead. There's nothing back there. They didn't find a body. But what they found was worse in some ways. Near the back corner of the barn, a patch of dirt had been recently disturbed. The ground smelled faintly of bleach. A rusted garden hose lay coiled beside it like a dead snake. One deputy knelt and swabbed a dark stain on a fence post, something that looked like it had been scrubbed. But not enough. Within 48 hours, the forensics came back. Blood type matched. DNA confirmed. It was Caleb Branson's. That doesn't mean he's dead, Emily told Sheriff Murdoch later that week. Her voice clipped. He worked out there all the time. Probably cut himself on a nail. It was on the inside of the fence post, Murdoch replied. And we found bleach. We clean around here, Sheriff. It's a ranch, not a crime scene. Narration continued as words spread fast. The small town didn't need proof to form opinions. Folks started using the word murder the way they used to say missing. Emily noticed it in the way the grocer bagged her items slower, the way the pastor's wife stopped hugging her after church. That week, she hired an attorney from Lubbock, high-priced, silver-haired. He arrived in a spotless black truck and called the sheriff's office within hours, requesting that all future communications go through him. Sheriff Murdoch poured himself a glass of rye whiskey that night and stared at the old hunting photo of him and Caleb nailed to the office wall. He didn't like the way things were headed, didn't like that it might all lead to the Branson name becoming a headline. Then came Rachel Stiles, a young forensic specialist from Dallas, assigned by the state after the DNA hit. She wasn't like the others. She didn't care about last names or family legacies. She walked the property twice, took notes, and said flatly, "There's more here. The bleach trail curves east." Something was dragged. "You suggesting this was a dump site?" Murdoch asked. "No," Rachel said. "I'm suggesting this was where it began." And someone panicked. Cinematic description. At sunset, Rachel stood by the barn with the wind pulling at her ponytail. She crouched, brushing her gloved hand over the dust, revealing faint streaks too wide for a shovel, too narrow for machinery. She looked up at the fence line, at the horizon where the land dipped and vanished. Something shimmered in her eyes, recognition or dread. From the porch, Emily watched her. She held a glass of iced tea, her other hand wrapped tightly around the railing. And somewhere inside the house, Reed was packing a bag. The soil had started to speak. Not loud, not yet, but enough that someone was about to listen. The summons was folded neatly in the mailbox when Jenna Blake arrived back in town. She hadn't spoken to Emily in over a year, not since their mother's funeral, where Emily refused to cry and Jenna refused to pretend they were ever close. But now, a judge wanted both sisters in court to resolve the matter of the Branson Ranch estate, specifically the parcels Caleb had left behind. Jenna didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in patterns, and something about her sister's silence since Caleb vanished set off an old alarm in her chest, the same one that rang years ago when Emily called sobbing from the bathroom of a Texaco off Highway 62. Narration picks up the memory. A cold November night in 2004. Emily had begged Jenna to come get her, said Caleb had locked the doors, said he didn't hit her. Not exactly, but made her feel like she was slowly drowning in her own skin. When Jenna picked her up, Emily was shaking. She had bruises on her wrist and one eye bloodshot from crying. "I don't want to be married to him anymore," she whispered. "I wish he'd just disappear. I wish he were gone." Jenna made her promise then, "If it ever gets worse, you tell me, you leave, you don't stay." But Emily did stay, and she never called again. Now Jenna stood on the dusty courthouse steps in the same boots she'd worn 10 years ago. She didn't bother knocking when she arrived at the ranch, just walked through the unlocked door. Emily was in the kitchen slicing peaches. She didn't look up. "Didn't expect you. I'm sure you didn't," Jenna said. They hadn't hugged, hadn't even made eye contact. "I hear you're selling the rest," Jenna continued, already divvying up a man's life before anyone's proved he's dead. Emily wiped her hands on a towel. "That land doesn't need proving." Later that evening, they sat on the porch, 2 glasses of wine between them and a silence that grew thick with memory. "You still wear that cross," Emily said, glancing at Jenna's neck. "And you still pretend nothing ever happened," Jenna replied. "I remember the things you told me, Em. I remember how scared you were." Emily didn't answer. "You wanted him gone," Jenna said. "I didn't forget that either." Emily turned sharply. Wanting someone gone isn't the same as making them vanish, no. But it's a start. Narration dips into Jenna's reflection. She had watched her sister shrink over the years, her hair getting plainer, her voice quieter, her eyes duller. Caleb had chipped away at Emily until all that remained was something polished on the outside and hollow underneath. It wasn't just fear, it was conditioning, control, a quiet kind of captivity. But Jenna had seen a flicker of something tonight, a smile, too quick to be natural, a gleam in Emily's eyes when she talked about moving on. Cinematic description. That night, Jenna lay awake in the guest bedroom, listening to the creaks of the old house. Rain tapped the window in soft rhythms. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Emily on the phone whispering. She pressed her ear to the door. "You promised me, Reed. You promised me it was done." A pause. Then, "We can't let her dig." Jenna stepped back, heart pounding. In the kitchen, a peach sat half sliced on the counter, the knife still beside it. And outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of something long buried. Jenna didn't sleep. She lay still in the guest room, listening through the old vents. The wind had died down, but Emily's voice lingered in her ears like smoke. "You promised me, Reed." By morning, Emily was gone. Only the faint smell of her perfume clung to the hallway, and her car was already missing from the drive. 3 miles away, in the shadow of the ridge, Reed Pritchard's trailer sagged against the dry earth like a secret too long kept. Inside, the walls were thin, so thin, in fact, that Mrs. Langley next door could hear almost everything. She'd told her son last week that she didn't trust the late-night visits. "Grown folks don't whisper that way unless they got something to hide," she said, half hoping she was wrong. But last night, she heard shouting, muffled, frantic, and a slam so hard her cat bolted under the fridge. "You said it was handled," Emily hissed. "You said I didn't have to carry this anymore." Reed stood by the door, fists clenched. "You told me to make it stop, Em, not clean up the damn universe for you. You owe me," she snapped. He looked at her, then like she was something he'd never fully recognized. "What did you do that night?" Emily blinked for a moment. Everything was silent, except the hollow hum of the ceiling fan and the sound of her breath. Catching flashback 6 months earlier. The barn light flickered overhead as Caleb's boots dragged through the dirt. He was drunk, shouting at nothing, or maybe shouting at everything he'd lost. Control, respect, Emily. She stood in the corner, arms tight across her chest. Reed was behind her, uncertain. Caleb lunged. Reed stepped forward, but Emily stopped him. Her voice was calm. "Let me talk to him." They walked into the stall. Reed waited outside. A minute passed, then 5. Then silence when he looked inside. Caleb was slumped over, breathing, barely, blood dripping from his nose. Emily held a wooden beam in her hands. Her face was blank. "You saw what he was," she whispered. "You said you'd help me." Reed stared at her like he'd seen a stranger. "Not like this." Emily dropped the beam. "Then help me fix it." Back in the present, Reed pressed his palms against the counter. "You didn't say he'd fight. You didn't say he'd crawl halfway across the field. You said you buried him," Emily said coldly. "I buried a man who was still breathing, Emily." A long pause. She walked to the window. The land stretched out like a wound behind glass. "And what do you want me to do now?" "Dig him up and say sorry." Reed turned away. "I want you to stop acting like you're the victim." She laughed bitterly. "I was. Not anymore," he muttered. Outside, Mrs. Langley sat on her porch with her tea, pretending not to listen. But she saw Emily's car peel away, dust spiraling in her wake. She saw Reed step onto the porch minutes later, pale and shaking, running. A hand through his hair as if trying to erase something only he could still feel. And she made a note to herself. Call the sheriff. Not because she liked the law, but because she knew the sound of guilt when it cracked through drywall. The wind carried whispers, but no one listened closely. Mrs. Langley made the call to the sheriff's office the morning after Emily sped away from Reed's trailer. She didn't give names, just said something wasn't right. Not since Caleb Mercer vanished into the earth like he'd never existed. But Sheriff Roy Danner had heard it all before, and he'd heard worse. He drove out that afternoon past the brittle fields to the edge of the Mercer ranch. He found nothing. No blood, no weapon, no answers, just the yawning silence of land too wide to confess. By the end of the week, Reed Pritchard was gone. No note, no goodbye. His trailer emptied overnight. Just an oil stain where his truck had sat. August 2007. The case was closed without a formal press release. Just a short memo slipped into a file. Stamped insufficient evidence. The town accepted it like they did dry spells and bad harvests. A thing that just happened. Caleb Mercer was officially missing. Unofficially dead. Everyone knew. No one said except Jenna. She watched her sister step into the courthouse with fresh curls and a black dress, mourning a man no one had found. By law, Caleb was declared presumed deceased. By law, the ranch transferred to Emily. Jenna watched the judge's gavel fall. In her mind, it was the sound of a door closing. 6 years later, 2013. The ranch didn't change, but Emily did. She painted the shutters white, tore down the old barn, built a new shed in its place. Her new husband, Dr. Nathan Coleridge, a quiet veterinarian from Boone, moved in by fall. The town liked him, gentle, kind-eyed, too naive for questions. They married in a small ceremony under the cottonwoods. Emily wore cream and smiled like a ghost. She gave speeches at the local fair, donated hay to the church stable, hosted Thanksgiving dinners for neighbors who once whispered behind her back. But the whispers never fully stopped. She got away with it, some said. Caleb wasn't right in the head, others offered. A man like that doesn't just vanish, murmured Mrs. Langley, now living with her son in Tulsa, but still writing in her journals about that one long night in June. Jenna never moved back, but she never let go. She sent letters, visited the sheriff's office every year on Caleb's birthday, asked about soil tests, wrote the names of people who stopped making eye contact each time. Sheriff Danner would sigh and say, "It's been years, Jenna," and each time she'd reply, "So what?" She kept a box under her bed in Denver, newspaper clippings, old voicemail recordings, a blurry photograph of Reed and Emily at a gas station just days before Caleb disappeared. Reed was looking at her. Emily wasn't looking at anyone. Scene, winter 2013. Snow fell in soft layers across the empty yard. Inside the Mercer ranch, Emily stirred honey into her tea. Her husband read a veterinary journal by the fireplace. It should have been peace. But peace doesn't come to the haunted. She stood at the kitchen sink, staring out across the field where the barn once stood. Something moved. Just a rabbit, she told herself, or maybe the wind. But the air felt wrong, like something buried too long had shifted. She dropped her spoon. That spring, a local boy named Elijah Trask lost his drone in the fields just north of the property line. He and his brother went looking for it with a shovel and a metal detector. What they found wasn't plastic. It was bone. Just one, at first. Then more, a shallow grave, a mess of fabric tangled in root and rust. The boys ran screaming to the edge of the property, flagged down a deputy. This time, Sheriff Danner didn't wait. Cinematic ending. The field was cordoned off by yellow tape. Cameras arrived by morning. Old neighbors came back in trucks and folding chairs. Like it was a show they'd waited too long to watch. Jenna stood behind the barricade, arms crossed, eyes glassy. Someone beside her said, "Guess that'll be the end of it now." But Jenna didn't answer, because in her chest, something new had awakened. Not just relief, not just vindication. It was fear, because what they uncovered in that shallow grave wasn't who she thought it would be. The earth remembers what people try to forget. They came for the drone, they stayed for the bones, but in the end, it was the desert that gave up the secret. The sun rose over a flat stretch of parched land just west of the Pecos River, where heat shimmered off the sand, and silence blanketed everything but wind and buzzards. Tyler Leach wasn't. From there, he worked remote tech support from Austin. But every spring he spent a few weeks running trails in the desert, training for ultramarathons. Said it cleared his head, kept him honest. He didn't expect to trip. At first, he thought it was a rock jutting from the ground like a fossil rib. But when he knelt and brushed the sand away, his fingers scraped rusted metal. A box. It was an old .50 caliber military ammo box, dented and sun-scorched. Heavy, the latch was fused with time. He used a stick to pry it open. What he saw inside stopped him cold. A cracked human skull, partial vertebrae, a wedding band dulled with dust, slipped over a brittle finger bone still holding shape. The ring had two initials carved inside, C.N. By the time law enforcement arrived, Tyler had backed far away, vomited twice, and called his sister. She told him to stay where he was and record everything. The box was flown to Lubbock for forensic analysis. The skull told a story no one wanted to hear again. July 2013. The news broke like thunder through a dry town. Breaking: human remains found in West Texas desert belonged to long-missing Caleb Mercer. DNA confirmed it. The ring confirmed it. The jaw injury, a hairline fracture from a horseback accident Caleb sustained in 2006, matched dental records. Local reporters swarmed the Mercer Ranch by evening. By morning, the national ones arrived. They lined up on the dirt road with microphones, satellites, and sweat-drenched shirts. A camera drone hovered low over the cottonwoods where Emily had said her vows just 2 years prior. One reporter called it the Ranch of Bones. Emily didn't come outside, but her husband did, Nathan. Coleridge stood on the porch for 20 minutes, arms crossed, eyes scanning the sea of journalists. He answered no questions, but his face said enough. That night, he packed a duffel bag and left. Jenna watched from her rental car across the street. She saw the porch light flicker. She saw Emily's silhouette in the window, still, unmoving. She didn't cry. She didn't chase him. The sheriff gave a statement 2 days later. "We believe the individual known as Reed Pritchard may have transported Caleb's remains out of state. The container was found 92 miles from the Mercer property. A new task force is reviewing all evidence. New tech, new eyes, new pressure." Suddenly, the case that had died quietly in a manila folder came roaring back to life. Forensic software could now reconstruct fracture patterns. Soil analysis from inside the box dated the burial window to June 2007. Jenna's voice, once ignored, was now the loudest in every room. She did interviews, podcasts, even a Netflix producer called. But what gnawed at her wasn't the attention. It was the box. Why move the body? Why now? And who buried it with the ring still on? She hadn't slept in 2 nights. Her phone buzzed every hour. Reporters, lawyers, distant cousins pretending to care. She ignored them all, But it wasn't the news that haunted her, it was the box. She saw it in her dreams, that old, rusted green, the way the latch twisted, the skull, his skull, and the ring that once meant something. Nathan had asked her, before he left, did you know? She hadn't answered, not because she didn't have one, but because she didn't know which version of the truth she was allowed to speak anymore. That she touched her own wedding band, removed it, set it on the nightstand like it burned. Meanwhile, in a basement lab in Austin, a forensic analyst zoomed in on corrosion patterns inside the ammo box. Something didn't sit right. The bones had been moved, yes, but the decay didn't match the timeline they'd expected. There was a second trace of DNA, faint but there, female. Not Emily's, not Jenna's. It was someone new. Or someone long forgotten. Back in West Texas, Jenna visited Caleb's declared grave, a temporary marker the town council set up near the river until the remains were officially released. She knelt, brushing dust off the stone. I told them, she whispered, and now they believe me. But I don't think they know the half of it. Behind her, a truck idled for too long. She turned, but it pulled away before she caught the plates. She stayed a while longer, just listening. The wind carried whispers again, but they sounded closer now, louder, meaner. The town had waited 6 years to forget. Now it would remember everything. But memory doesn't always come in order, and the past wasn't done yet. The discovery of Caleb Branson's skull sent a shudder through the dusty town of Marfa, Texas. By week's end, reporters were staked out in folding chairs across from Emily's ranch. Drones buzzed overhead, and national news tickers labeled it the cold case that came back to burn. Emily refused to speak publicly. Instead, she stayed behind locked doors, her second husband long gone. The front gate now bearing a bold red sign, nitrogen monoxide trespassing, private property. But the case was no longer just local. The FBI got involved after county officials fumbled interviews, and paperwork vanished from the original investigation. It was Assistant Special Agent Teresa Knox who pushed for a federal wiretap, citing inconsistencies, missing files, and the sudden reappearance of Reed Branson, now suspected of being more than just Caleb's estranged brother. Within a week, the wiretap was live. Emily's voice, flat and deliberate, crackled through speakers in a trailer behind the sheriff's department. They know about the box. She whispered on the third intercepted call. You should have buried it deeper. A pause. Then a male voice, gruff and quieter than hers. It wasn't me who picked the spot. That was all you, Em. That voice belonged to Reed. But he no longer went by Reed Branson. The call came from an encrypted VoIP line originating in Mérida, Mexico. His new name was Peter Locke, but his past couldn't be erased. On the next call, Emily's tone shifted, fear laced with control. You promised me, Reed. You swore you'd never talk. I held up my end. I kept your name out of it. No, Reed muttered. But you didn't tell me everything, did you? There was a silence. A long one. Don't start this, she snapped. But the agents listening in weren't just focused on Emily anymore. Reed had made a private call the same day, not to Emily, but to a US-based lawyer. In it, he gave a carefully worded, shaky confession. His voice trembled as he recounted that night in 2006, the whiskey, the shouting, Emily crying in the barn, Caleb storming off toward the backfield with a rifle in hand. I thought she'd calm him down, Reed said, but when I went out there 20 minutes later, he was gone. She was standing by the fence line, holding something wrapped in canvas. Her hands were shaking. He paused, breath ragged. I helped move it. Didn't even ask what it was. He didn't say the word body. but the implication suffocated the room. He described driving with her at 3 a.m., past dry creek beds and oil fields, stopping in a wash that no one ever visited. She pulled out the box, a metal ammo case once owned by Caleb's grandfather, and dropped it into the sand. She poured something inside at first, but Reed claimed he never looked. I wanted to believe it was just symbolic. I didn't open it. God help me. The tape, submitted under seal, was enough to reignite the investigation. But Reed wasn't done. At the end of the call, he added something peculiar. She lied to me that night. I know that now. She made me think she was scared, but she wasn't. Not really. There was a calm in her, like she'd planned it all. Meanwhile, back in Marfa, Emily seemed frayed, but composed. She spent most of her days walking the perimeter of the ranch, as if counting fence posts. At night, she barely slept. Jenna noticed lights flickering on and off in the barn. She began documenting them every hour, every pattern. One night, she caught Emily digging near the old horse shed with a flashlight. But the biggest shock wasn't Emily's behavior. It was the revelation that came next. Reed had left out a detail from his confession. In a later intercepted call with an ex-lover in Belize, he finally admitted it. She told me he'd been abusive, that he threatened to kill her, but I saw Caleb that afternoon. He wasn't angry, he was scared. He'd found a letter, one she wrote. It said, "It's almost time. He trusts me now." Caleb thought it was about another man, but I think he stopped short. I think she was talking about me. The agents replayed that tape a dozen times. The implication was staggering. Emily might not have manipulated just Caleb. She might have planned this years in advance, sowing mistrust, isolating Reed, and when the time came, using him like a pawn. Meanwhile, Jenna took her own steps. She visited the old Branson farmhouse's attic, where their mother had once kept family journals. Tucked between yellowing pages was a letter, never sent, addressed to Caleb. It read, "Emily isn't who you think she is. I've seen her watching you sleep. Be careful what you tell her." The handwriting was unmistakably Reed's, Jenna's. Hands trembled as she closed the book. Outside, the wind picked up over the west field. Dust swirled toward the dark horizon. Somewhere in Mexico, Reed poured another drink, staring into nothing. And Emily, well, she was already preparing for what came next. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. Flames lit the West Texas horizon like a second dawn. By the time fire trucks reached the Branson Ranch, the barn was a skeleton, scorched, collapsed, groaning as it surrendered to the final licks of flame. Heat shimmered above the debris, and black smoke curled into the starlit sky. Locals stood behind yellow tape, half-dressed, murmuring theories as phones recorded the blaze. Some recognized Emily's silhouette standing barefoot in the gravel, watching her world burn with eerie calm. She lit it herself. The fire chief muttered to the deputy beside him. Didn't even call it in. Earlier that day, federal agents had filed charges. The FBI wiretap, Reed's confession, and the forensic match to Caleb's skull had been enough. They planned to arrest Emily in the morning. She had known. Inside the smoldering wreck, investigators later found twisted fragments of a charred shovel, melted bits of what might have been a lockbox, and the remains of what was once a tarp, possibly stained, though fire had erased what it could. But one thing the flames failed to consume lay in a metal feed bin, half buried under collapsed timber, a journal, handwritten, wrapped in 2 layers of thick plastic, bound with duct tape, scorched around the edges, but intact. An agent unwrapped it like something sacred. The cover was cracked leather, initials ECB embossed in fading gold. The pages inside messy, urgent, uneven were written over the course of months. In 2006, they began with musings on Caleb's temper, his obsession with control, and spiraled into fury and confession. I lost myself in that marriage, one entry read. I became someone I didn't recognize, someone who lied about bruises and smiled at funerals. Another, more fragmented. The first time he locked me in the cellar, I was still pregnant. He told me it was for my own good, said the world out there was poison, that I needed to be pure. But the entry that would haunt the prosecution and America was dated September 19, 2006. It read, "He wasn't dead when I buried him. I thought he was. Reed thought he was. But when the soil was halfway up his chest, he moved. Just a little, a twitch. I couldn't stop. I heard him choke my name, and I kept digging. I kept going, because I knew if I hesitated, if I let the truth in, I would break forever." Prosecutors wept when they read it. Hardened agents stared at the wall for hours. The barn had once held horses, hay, tractors. It now held a horror no fire could erase. 2 days later, Emily was arrested outside a roadside motel in Pecos County, wearing dark glasses and carrying a duffel bag. Her second husband had vanished, his bank account emptied, his car abandoned. Some said he had fled to Costa Rica. Others believed he never existed at all. The nation watched. Rap. Talk shows debated Emily's sanity. Documentaries picked apart. Her words, Jenna, stoic as ever, stood at every press conference, refusing to let her sister rewrite the past. She didn't snap. Jenna told a reporter. She planned. She controlled. That's what makes it worse. In jail, Emily refused interviews. She stopped eating. She braided her hair tightly each morning and stared out the narrow window above her bunk, her hands folded like she was praying. But in one strange moment, she broke her silence. A letter, handwritten, sent to the federal agent who'd first unwrapped the journal. You read the pages, but did you read between them? Caleb didn't die that night. Not all of him. Some part of him crawled into me. And every day after that, I felt it moving, twisting, speaking. The fire wasn't to hide the truth. It was to kill what was left. The letter was filed into evidence, but never released publicly. Some claimed it was poetic madness. Others saw it as a final manipulation. Either way, the trial was set. And somewhere in a border town just south of Del Rio, Reed watched the fire footage on a bar television, the journal's excerpt scrolling across the bottom of the screen. His drink trembled in his hand. He had known part of the story, but never all. Emily hadn't lied to protect him. She'd lied to trap him, to keep him tethered by guilt. And now, the trial was coming, and with it, one final secret no one had yet uncovered. The courtroom was silent when the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. The judge's voice rang through the chamber like a funeral bell. Emily didn't flinch. She stood motionless as the sentence was read. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. No expression crossed her face, no tears, no plea for mercy. She looked past the jury, past the gallery, like none of them existed. Reed sat in the back, his hands trembling in his lap. He hadn't spoken during the trial, hadn't testified. He had shown up only once it was clear she wouldn't escape. Conviction. The man who had once followed Emily like a shadow now sat in the farthest row, as though afraid of her reflection. Jenna, seated near the front, felt no triumph, only a hollowness that stretched across the courtroom like a winter fog. Justice had come, but not cleanly. It dragged blood and ash behind it. Outside, reporters shouted questions. Why did she do it? Was Caleb really abusive? What about Reed? Will he be charged next? Jenna said nothing. Instead, in the weeks that followed, she poured her energy into what Emily had tried to destroy: truth. She partnered with advocacy groups, spoke at universities, traveled to schools, shelters, churches, anywhere people would listen. Her talks didn't focus on Emily. They focused on the silence that let Emily happen, on communities that look away from bruises, on families that confuse compliance with healing. She was a victim once, Jenna said at a televised panel, but then she chose to become a predator, and no one stopped her. We called it resilience. We called it strength, but we never asked, at what cost? Emily's sentencing marked the end of the trial, but not the end of consequences. Limestone Hollow, the sleepy town once known for peach festivals and cattle auctions, became infamous overnight. Tourists came to see the ruins of the barn. True crime enthusiasts posed near the Branson mailbox. News vans camped by the diner, asking locals how they felt living next to a killer. Property values plummeted. The church split. Half the congregation believed Emily was pure evil. The other half still whispered about what Caleb might have done behind closed doors. The truth didn't heal the town. It fractured it. Caleb's body, or what was left of it, was finally laid to rest in a modest grave near the edge of the cemetery. For months, it went unmarked. No one claimed the responsibility. No one wanted to seem sympathetic. But on a cold March morning, someone placed a stone. It read, Caleb Branson, 1977 to 2006, let the truth judge us all. No one admitted to paying for it. Jenna denied it. Reed vanished again. Some say it was the sheriff. Others believe it was a neighbor who once heard Caleb shouting and did nothing the day after the stone appeared. Jenna visited the grave alone. She stood beneath the gray sky, arms crossed, her breath visible in the air. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But she stayed for hours. Reed, for his part, tried to disappear. He drifted through small towns and border cities, never staying long. He worked under fake names, dishwashing in Louisiana, oil fields in Midland, truck stops in New Mexico. He refused interviews, burned every letter from journalists. But one night in a motel in Deming, he finally answered a knock on his door. It was a young woman, barely 20, holding a copy of the journal Emily had left behind. She had tears in her eyes. I think I was becoming her, she whispered. Reed didn't let her in, but he listened for hours. And when she left, he did something he hadn't done in years. He called Jenna. I want to tell the truth, he said. All of it. Not to clear my name, to make sure no one like her ever does this again. Jenna hesitated, then said okay, but we do it my way, together. They helped produce a documentary, not about Emily the monster, but about the people who let monsters grow. About the small towns where violence hides behind smiles and church pews. About men like Caleb and women like Emily. It was raw, it was brutal, it was honest, and it ended with Jenna's voice. Justice isn't always a clean verdict in a clean courtroom. Sometimes it's what we do after the ashes settle. Sometimes it's deciding we won't look away again. Emily, meanwhile, remained locked away in a federal prison in Colorado. She refused all interviews. Her hair turned gray prematurely. Inmates avoided her, not out of fear, but something closer to superstition. She never spoke of the journal again. Never confirmed what she meant by he moved. Never apologized. And one winter morning, a guard found her standing by her narrow window, staring at the falling snow. She whispered something, the guard would later say, but I couldn't make it out. What she said didn't matter, because the fire was over, but the smoke would linger for years. The desert hadn't changed. Wind still scraped across the plains like it had for centuries, carrying the dust of stories no one wanted to tell. Mile marker 56 stood crooked now, rusted at the edges, sun-faded numbers barely visible. People passed it without slowing down, unaware of the secrets buried in the dirt nearby. But Jenna knew. She came alone that spring morning, 6 months after the trial ended. A bouquet of bluebonnets trembled in her hands as she knelt by the modest headstone recently placed beside the marker. Caleb Branson minus 1,974 to 2007, recovered 2012. Below that, in smaller engraving, the silence wasn't your fault. Jenna ran her fingers over the stone. The wind tangled her hair, and tears stung her eyes. Though she no longer wept for Caleb, she wept for all of them, for the way the truth had come too late, for the way Emily had rotted from the inside out, for Reed, who had vanished again after the sentencing, leaving behind a one-line postcard, "Forgiveness is a myth I can't afford." Nothing more. The community didn't talk much about the Branson case anymore. The ranch had been sold to a developer who planned to turn the land into vacation cabins. Some said they'd heard crying at night near the ashes of the old barn. Others claimed the place was cursed. But most people, especially the ones who had once protected Emily, simply looked away. Jenna stayed. She took a part-time job at the local community center and started a support group for those trapped in emotional and psychological abuse. Most attendees came in silence, eyes lowered, unsure why they felt broken even though nothing physical ever happened. Jenna knew better now. Scars on the soul often ran deeper than those on the skin. One night, a teenage girl showed up. She looked out of place, too young to know words like manipulation, trauma, coercion. But she sat in the circle anyway. When her turn came, she whispered, "My mom says I'm dramatic. My stepdad says I lie. But when I told them I saw him drag our dog out back, they said I imagined it." Jenna didn't flinch. She simply nodded and said, "You're not alone, and you're not crazy." After the meeting ended, Jenna walked out under the Texas stars. She lit a cigarette she wouldn't finish and stared at the sky. The wind was warm. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called. It reminded her of the night Caleb first vanished, how silence had swallowed the truth whole for years. But silence didn't last forever. She returned to mile marker 56 each month, planted wildflowers, cleared weeds, spoke to Caleb like he could hear her, not as a ghost, but as a wound she refused to let scar over until it taught something. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it comes slowly, quietly, in petals, in confessions, in headlines too late to save anyone. But sometimes it still comes.